All right, I'm back. Today I thought I would talk about something a little bit different than kind of where I started off with. When I first started off, I was just basically explaining this is going to be my VCast for a while, or vlog, or whatever they call these things, um, and kind of told you a little bit about myself, such as, historical background and all that kind of stuff. But then I went into explaining about my new car that I bought, the 2019 Honda Insight, which I'm very happy about, and I keep mentioning over and over again, and I probably will. Um, this time I thought I would go a little bit of a different direction. I'm a writer, and so one of the other aspects of this whole vlog blog that I actually wanted to do was to devote about a third of it talking about writing and the craft of writing. I know a lot of writers tend to write about their own selves, such as, these are my books, buy them, that kind of sort of thing. That's not really where I want to go with this. I mean, I may mention them from time to time, like today I'll probably mention a couple of my previous ones, but kind of only in context to discussing what I want to discuss with you today. Okay, couple of background things I wanted to cover is, well, first off, I noticed that I'm still kind of having some time getting used to the work set that I have actually here. I noticed when I watched the first couple of videos that for some reason the videos keep coming to a point where it makes me look identical to Brad Pitt. And I know there's a lot of girls out there that are looking at it and going, we're kind of sick of Brad Pitt, Dwayne, so you need to go with a completely different look. And I totally understand that, and so I will work on that. It is a burden. I totally understand, and like I said, I will work on that. The other thing you're probably going to mention, or you're probably going to notice a whole bunch of times, is I will probably be drinking out of my soda while I'm sitting here. There's no alcohol in it. I haven't had alcohol in years. Not because I have a problem, unless it's like the one on Airplane where he just kept, missing his mouth. No, I just stopped with alcohol, and so now I drink Diet Dr. Pepper all the time. This is not actually a commercial for Diet Dr. Pepper. I mean, I'm not a commercial kind of a person. But, should you end up buying Diet Dr. Pepper, it is a great product, and I think America will benefit if you buy it. Was that good enough? All right, we're good. Okay. All right, so kind of getting back to where we were, I wanted to talk a little bit about writing. And so there are a lot of people out there who want to be writers, some who have been writing most of their life and aren't sure if they actually are one, but would kind of like to be one, or think they are but don't know that they are, and they're really not sure if they want to get into the business of it. And we'll talk a little bit about the business as well, because it's changed over the years and it's much different from when I first started. I mean, when I first started, you had to give your novel to dinosaurs, and dinosaurs brought it out into the Jurassic era or area, and then had other dinosaurs look at it, and then they would decide whether or not you'd be published. Much different industry back then. So I want to talk a little bit about the history. My history when I first got involved in writing, just so you kind of get an idea of the kinds of things that I write. I started writing when I was really, really young. I wrote a bunch of short stories that got awards, so I was kind of rewarded when I was really young, convinced that I was going to be a writer because everyone kept telling me, oh, you're going to be a writer. And you kind of get that ego going after a while, and it probably wasn't all that helpful because I was convinced I was a great writer as a child, and I wasn't. So it took me a number of years to kind of figure out I didn't know everything I thought I knew, and I kind of had to relearn it. One of the things I learned really, really quickly, and then continued to expand upon over the years, is to be a decent writer. And I'm not saying I'm a great writer, but I know I'm a decent writer. But to be one, you need to read a lot. And I can't tell you the number of people I've met over the years who don't read anything, yet call themselves writers. And it's really fascinating to see, because here's what happens is one person gets really successful and has done that, and then everybody else is convinced they don't have to do it, like never have to read anything. It's kind of like the one guy that tells you that well, if you don't go to college, you can do really, really well because this one guy that made billions of dollars never went to college. And that kind of feeds itself, and then people stop going to college, and then basically they don't get degrees, and their lives aren't as great as they originally intended it to be because they didn't become that billionaire they were actually intending to become. All right. So going back to my history, I started writing when I was really, really young. I wrote my first novel, and I'll put that in quotations, my first novel, back when I was probably 12, I think it was. It was called The Victoria 3, and if I remember correctly, it was some kind of James Bondian kind of a story to it. I don't really recall it. I do remember reading it years and years later and just kind of laughing hysterically, because that's the kind of stuff you write when you're that young, but convinced you're writing great novels. And I think that novel was somewhere around 112, 120 pages. So it wasn't really a novel, but it was the first completed thing I had actually done. And part of the problem on that, and this is what I want to talk about a little bit, is a lot of people will write their very first novel and are convinced that's the masterpiece they need to share with you. And that becomes a real problem, because they'll spend all of their time, or at least they used to spend all of their time, trying to ship that one novel out there. It's much worse now, because now when they finish their novel, they just upload it to Amazon and they wonder why the sales aren't going through the roof. I mean, they hear, you know, the Twitter woman, or the the one who wrote the 50 Shades of Ties, I don't know what her book was, anyway, who wrote those and got absolute fame immediately. It doesn't happen. It rarely happens to anybody. It just happened on 2 romance books, basically. Originally young adult romance books, but you get the idea. So anyway, so I started out, like I said, really young, and then I just kept writing. I went to West Point, so I got into the service, and while I was serving in the military, I was out in the field once. Well, I was out in the field a lot of times, but I was out in the field once, and I'd run out of things to read. And so it was one of those where you're out there for quite a while, and you got a lot of downtime, so you want to do some kind of reading, and didn't have anything. So I sat down and just started writing something. I had this novel in my mind, and I was going to write it. So I spent quite a bit of time while we were out in the field, because we went out quite often. And so I kept writing. Then I brought it back to my office, and I would write it there all the time. I didn't know it at the time, but my commanding officer kept coming into my office and reading my novel every night, because what I would do is I would finish whatever chapters I finished, and then the next day I would print out those, and then I would edit them by hand and then reprint them out. I had this old Radio Shack Model 3, or I had the Model 4 at this time. So I had the Radio Shack Model 4, and so I had those 2 floppy drives, and so I would print it out all the time, and I would put all my files onto that floppy drive. Well, back then, and this really dates me, word processing software wasn't like today. You don't make just a copy of it and then it's on there forever. As a matter of fact, when you open your word processing program, it kind of was the actual file itself. So in order to finish your file for that day, you had to close out the entire program, and that saved it. If you didn't do that, and I discovered this a couple of times in the past, before this, is it just scrambled your disk, and you ended up having to like reinstall it from scratch. So you had to make sure you always saved it at the very end, and then that would be the one that you could run next time. So I got to a point where I was writing this novel, and it was about a 200-page novel, and I had the first 150 pages. They were all on one floppy drive, so now they didn't fit anymore. It's not like today where you can fit tons of novels on the same drive. And so I had that one aside, and then I had the second floppy drive in there, and then I went to save it because I just finished the novel. It was one of those marathon, I think I worked 2 days in a row nonstop on the weekend, and I finished it. It was a great ending. It was like the best ending you could possibly imagine. And then I went to save it, and the whole power went out in the building. I lost the entire novel, or the entire last 50 pages of the novel. And I took that as a sign that I was not meant to be a writer. So I just stopped writing. I said, if it's not going to let me do this, then I quit. Went back and started doing other things, started going to, Officers Club and having a good time there, because I was like, writing was not my thing. And then I got called into the captain's office, and he wanted to talk to me. And he said, what happened to your novel? I'm like, what do you mean? And he goes, you were writing a novel, weren't you? I was like, yes, sir, I was. How do you know that? And he goes, what happened to the ending of it? I was like, the ending? I was like really confused by this. And he goes, yeah, the ending. And I went, and then I told him the story of what actually happened. And he goes, well, I have an assignment for you. This next weekend, you're going to sit down and finish the last 50 or so pages of this book, and then you'll be done. And I was like, that seemed like a really odd request out of nowhere, and it wasn't an official military job of any sort. And then I found out, he explained it to me right then and there, he was coming in after I left every night and reading my book. And he wanted to know how it was going to end, and he was not willing to let me not end it. So I sat down the next weekend and I finished the book. And that's how I finished my first book. So that was a decent book. As a matter of fact, it was this one. Let's see if I can get that in here. So this was in his, The Teddy Bear Conspiracy. It was my very first book. It was a mystery suspense. It was about a murder that happens in a corporate office, and all sorts of intrigue and lots of fun and backstabbing, betrayal and all this, which is really fascinating because I'd never worked in an office building before. I mean, military, out of school, and basically in the military once I got out of school. So anyway, that was my interesting first story. And so after that, years and years later, excuse me 1 second. Remember, I did mention my Diet Dr. Pepper. It's a great drink. So, okay. So, what I want to talk about right now is like the next stage of my writing. Because this is something a lot of people don't actually realize. People talk about writing their first book as really difficult, and it is really difficult because it's hard to really finish it, and you really panic over it and all that sort of stuff. And so people tend to not finish the first book. It doesn't matter how long it is. Mine at that time was, I think, ended up being 220 pages or something like that. People don't finish it. And when I finished it, I thought it was the greatest thing that ever happened to me in my life. I was just overjoyed. And then it was about a year or so later, I decided I need to see if that was just fire in a bottle or if that's really something I could continue to do. So I sat down again and I wrote my second book. And I will have to say it was the most difficult book I have ever written. And so the lesson to that, which I have a suspect is the same way with everybody else, that second book is really, really hard. And you don't realize why it would be really hard because you finish the first one and you're like, it's easy, I've done it. But what happens is when you start writing the second one, you get probably a quarter of the way through or maybe halfway through if you're lucky, and you start to question yourself going, did I really finish that first book? and you finished it, but it's like, did it make sense? I mean, the process, did it make sense? Or was I just lucky? Did I just have that one story in me? And you always hear people talking about, I've got this one story in me I want to write, and they never write it. But then I thought, okay, maybe it was that one story. And the even worse part of it was my first book, like I said, was a mystery suspense, and I decided to write a science fiction novel, which ended up being published as Leader of the Losers. Great title. It killed it for so long because nobody wanted to write it or publish a book called anything that had the word losers in it. Imagine that. Anyway, so that was my second book, and I remember I probably got about 2/3 of the way through it, and I felt a little bit better about it. And it was a struggle. I mean, a massive struggle. And I stopped and restarted, stopped and restarted, started rewriting the book from scratch and all that. Finally, I sat down and just finished it. So, for those of you who have actually written your first book and are now thinking about doing your second book, take that as a lesson from me. Forget the fact that you wrote the first one. Know what you're writing right now and finish that project. That should be the way you treat every book. And if you get any lesson from today, that should definitely be it. So I've written a whole bunch of books over my time. I've written mystery suspense, I've written science fiction, espionage fiction, betrayal espionage fiction. I've done a whole ton of fantasy, some fantasy lines. I've done, what else? I'm working on a historical perspective novel right now, which is going to be probably 3 novels in length. Not because I want to write a trilogy, but because it's going to take that much to finish the project. I've written a humorous novel, which was probably the hardest novel I ever wrote. People think it's the easiest because it comes off so smoothly, because it's all just, to them, just a bunch of jokes. And that one I actually have here too. This is the old cover that I had for it. And see if I can not cover this thing. So here is the old cover that I had for it, with the Statue of Liberty and this old ship kind of coming through. And it's the Untold Founding of America by the Survivors of Troy. It's actually called the Myriad. And the reason, or the process behind that book was, imagine if there was another set of survivors of Troy who went out to found their new land. So instead of finding Rome or finding Greece or whatever, not Greece, Rome or all these different places that they would find, or the Odyssey kind of coming back from it, and all these different stories that were telling their stories. The Aeneid, which tells another story of another hero that's the Roman one. And so I thought, well, wouldn't it be interesting to tell a story of the founding of America by the survivors of Troy, using all the American icons as gods? And because basically the whole idea of telling histories like that is you replace the old gods with the new gods. And I figured we don't actually have a whole bunch of gods, but we've got like lots of icons, like I had Visa, the god of the plastic people, stuff like that. Anyway, so that was my humorous novels. Well, I mean, like I said, I've written a whole bunch of different kinds of things. One of the things I used to do is I used to mentor people, and that's kind of why I wanted to do this well, it's not a podcast, but this vlog on writing as part of the process as well, because I taught a lot of people how to write, and so I would take them from step to step going through it, and the resistance I would get from so many people because they don't want to do the harder things, they want to do the easier things, and found out they weren't getting success from doing the easier things. And then quite often I would lead them into how to first approach the market, how to start with, magazine collections, and then finally books and all that, because there used to be a process that you'd have to follow before. It's changed a lot these days, but it was kind of interesting the way it used to work before. So basically that. So my question I ask, and this is kind of what I want to delve into as we go further into these different casts of these informative kind of stories is to ask, why do you want to be a writer? And there are people who really, really want to be writers, and then there are people who want to be seen as writers. And so I think the very first question you need to ask yourself is, which one of those am I? And we all kind of fall into it, because I will tell you, even though I am a writer, I've always spent most of my life wanting to be seen as a writer. So I understand the allure and the appeal to that. 1 second, got a Diet Dr. Pepper, drink of a nation. You do know they're not sponsoring me. I have no sponsors because nobody's to be sponsored for. Anyway, so where was I? I was talking about the whole idea of why you'd want to be a writer. And so there's lots of reasons people want to be writers. They want to be recognized as writers, but quite often they don't want to actually do any writing. And that leads to another kind of side to the problem, which is people who have written something and are convinced they're writers because of it. Quite often, these are the people who their parents used to tell them they're great writers because they write great letters, stuff like that. And that doesn't mean they're not good writers, and it doesn't mean they can't write novels and short stories and all this kind of stuff. But they still have a lot of work ahead of them if they want to be good writers. Now, having said that, anybody can be a writer. That's just out there. It's whether or not you want to be a good writer. And I would hope that most people who want to be writers want to be good writers. And that's not just to be seen as a good writer, but to know that you're a good writer. One of my favorite authors, and you may or may not be familiar with him, but Haruki Murakami, has written some great books. And so I read one of his books recently, or not recently, but a couple of years back, called What I Talk About When I Talk About Running. And didn't know it at the time, but the guy is a long distance runner. And he's not one of these guys who like spent his entire life training to be a long distance runner. He kind of woke up one day and said, I want to be a long distance runner. I want to run marathons. And then he started running marathons. And the interesting thing about the book, the reason why I'm telling you this, is he equated it to his his writing. And it was really interesting, the juxtaposition that he kind of threw in there to explain why this actually works. And so what you discover, and this is kind of how I've reinvented my writing as well to kind of follow this. I don't expect to ever be Haruki Murakami or as brilliant as the guy is, but I love the model that he chose, and I want to kind of follow that same kind of educational process. And what he does is every book he writes, he reinvents himself based off of everything he learned from the book before him. Which means when you're reading his next book, he never could have written that book before. And every subsequent book after is the same way. And so I started incorporating that into my writing process probably about 4 books back. And it's changed the entire style of how I actually write, which is why I'm constantly jumping genres. I don't jump them because I just want to change. I jump them because my next evolution of where I want to be with writing is to go to that next step. All right, so let me give you a couple of quick tips before we kind of go on, or go, and we'll come back for the next time because it's getting pretty long. What are some tips to actually do if you want to be a writer? Well, write a lot. It's going to take time. Don't expect success on the very beginning. Couple other things I kind of wrote down on the side over here, which is I mentioned the second book is almost always the hardest one to do. And one thing every successful writer will tell you is rewriting. Now, there are way too many people who finish a book and then send it out. One thing self-published writers are doing nowadays that they weren't doing before is they're actually getting readers to read their stuff. They call them sometimes beta readers. And so these beta readers will read their stuff, give them comments and tell them you need to work on this or you need to work on that. They'll do that, rewrite it, and then they've got something going. That's a great rewriting process, and it's also an editorial process that a lot of people generally haven't been using. So that's one thing where our market is getting a lot better, and we'll talk much more about that as we kind of go forward. So another thing just to kind of point out, and we'll, like I said, I'll get into these in much bigger detail or much more detail in further subsequent casts. One thing you need, and even I'm discovering this to be really, really difficult, social media. You need a social media presence, because the old market, which I kind of started in, and the old process of getting published and all that, is practically gone unless you were already massively famous before this, or you're just really lucky right now. And sometimes those old publishers are seeking out those people that are doing really well with social media and selling their books that way. So it's kind of a reverse process on kind of how it works. But if you have a social media presence, meaning you've got a lot of followers behind you, and maybe a couple of influencers, and we'll talk about those another time as well, that will make your career so much faster. That's all I've really got for today. I don't have much more to share with you other than buy Diet Dr. Pepper because it's the greatest drink on the planet. That's it. Have a good day.